Hello and welcome to Western Insights. Today is brought to you by Western's College of Business and in partnership with the Western Alumni Association and Foundation. It is Friday the 13th, so anything could happen today in our show. Our intention with Western Insights is to extend our expertise far beyond the classroom with our own internal subject matter experts and external guests. Today, we're going to spend some time exploring the labor market. You are not alone to ask what is exactly going on in the labor market right now, and how does it impact the economy in general? With nearly 2 open jobs for every job seeker, record unemployment, low workforce participation, and recent news of layoffs, it becomes difficult to know what is the good, the bad, and the ugly of the entire situation. As with too many topics related to economics, the push for simplicity and explanations often leaves far too many misconceptions. The complexity of the labor market creates some layers of resiliency, but also can lead to less desirable outcomes as it shifts and reinvents itself. With that in mind, we start today with the intention to make more sense of labor statistics and to begin to discuss what it all may mean in the months and years ahead. We encourage you to ask questions today. Use the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar. Let us know where you're looking for more information. Closed captioning is, of course, available for this event. You can access that through the closed captioning button in your menu bar as well. Joining our discussion today are 2 regional labor economists with the Washington State Employment Security Department. Annalise Vance Sherman has served as a regional labor economist since February 2010 with the department. The region she covers extends from the Seattle area to the Canada-US border. Annalise works closely with economic and workforce development partners throughout her region and statewide, providing local labor market intelligence to help inform strategic decision-making. Scott Bailey is the regional economist serving Southwest Washington. For over 30 years, Scott has tracked employment, unemployment, industries, occupations, and wages for 5 counties along the Columbia River. Scott produces an annual wage trend analysis for the state, including the impact of minimum wage, and has also authored chapters for his department's annual report to the legislature. Hart Hodges has the honor of facilitating this discussion today. Hart received his PhD in economics from the University of Washington. He joined the faculty at Western in the fall of 2000. He's taught a wide range of courses over the past 2 decades and conducted research in natural resource and environmental economics, health economics, and applied business economics. In addition to serving as faculty member at Western, Hart also co-directs the Center for Economic and Business Research. Our panelists and moderator all serve on the board of the Pacific Northwest Regional Economics Conference, or PNREC. This year's conference takes place this May in Walla Walla, and I'm sure we'll be sending out some more information on that later because everybody loves a good economics conference. Okay, Hart, let's dive in on this riveting conversation.
Thanks, James. Yeah, you mentioned Scott's work with minimum wage, so I'm going to jump in there. Scott, we've been asked quite a bit lately what the impact of Washington's increase in minimum wage really means. I mean, has the labor market been so tight that people are already earning more than the new minimum wage, or is it going to push wages up for a lot of people? Can you walk us through and help us understand what's happening with that?
You bet. First of all, thanks for inviting me to the show. And second of all, one of those, what I say is my opinion and not necessarily the views of the Employment Security Department. And thirdly, James, great choice of music, but we digress. So I've been tracking the minimum wage for a long time, going back to, the late 90s. Was the first time the state raised the minimum wage above the national minimum. And before that happened, only about 1.5% to 2% of jobs paid at or near plus or minus 2% the minimum wage. And then it rose more to the 2.5% to 3% over the years with ups and downs depending on recession and so on. And it was indexed to inflation, so that wasn't an issue. And then we had a couple of big voter approved jumps in the last couple of years, and particularly the last one right before COVID hit. So January 2020, the minimum wage went up an entire $1, and then COVID hit. And of course, it's hard to track what was going on then. But the short story is restaurant employment did not change in the first couple of months of 2020. When, if there was going to be an effect, you would have seen it. Number 2 thing is, if you look at wages in the next tier up, so I track the average wage for the bottom pay, 10%, and then the next 10%. So the old story about, well, if I give you a raise, then I have to give
That ripple effect.
Yeah. there basically isn't one, or it's very small. So all the textbook things that if you, I'm sorry to say, had to take Econ 101, that talks about job loss and the kind of ripple effect thing, just haven't happened in the state of Washington. And we are the #1 state, if you don't count the District of Columbia, in terms of the minimum wage. But so right now, in the last couple of years, that percent of jobs that are at or near the minimum is back down to about 1.5%. So it's not irrelevant. There are still jobs that pay that low, but it's become a smaller part of the labor market.
Okay, so just a percent or two of the people are going to see a small bump up in their wage because of that increase. Does that mean everybody else is doing fine? I mean, you mentioned that second 10%, not just the bottom. Is there a big portion of the workforce, or is it also small, say between that minimum wage and $20 an hour or something?
Yeah, no, that's about a quarter of the jobs, and it's actually, depending on what you mean by job. Because of the nature of the data, when I do this analysis, I convert it to full-time equivalent employment. So I'm actually talking about what percent of hours are paid at or near the minimum. Well, about a quarter of the hours paid by businesses in the state pay below $20 an hour. So if I did a what if in 2022, the minimum wage was bumped up to 20% or $20. So it would affect a lot of jobs. And there are there were, I think, over 90 employers where their payroll would go up by 20%. And those are largely fast food and ag employers,
Okay.
orchards and packing houses. 20% increase in your payroll overnight, that's a big impact.
Yeah,
so I think, again, if you raise the minimum wage high enough, you are going to see impacts on jobs, but I don't think we've hit that yet.
Okay. Now, I was just wondering, because if the minimum wage itself is not going to affect that many people directly, we still have a lot of folks at that low wage just above it, and we ought to be.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
and kind of looking at it from the income point of view rather than the wage per job point of view, we have a lot of households who, and what's the term, precariat, who are, one paycheck away, one root canal away from, serious household financial issues in terms of paying rent and putting food on the table. And many of them are struggling to put food on the table right now.
Okay, well, thanks for that uplifting view. Annalise, I'm going to switch to you. We've seen pretty strong wage growth at the lower end of the spectrum through COVID, and especially lately, as the labor market has been very, very tight, and employers have to try to pay more to attract or retain workers. Do you think that pressure will remain? And there's that upward pressure on wages, especially at the bottom, since the labor market is so tight, or do you think that's going to subside soon?
Well, Scott already addressed some of the evidence of wage growth in lower wage jobs and some of the jobs that will be impacted. So in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Low wage jobs in the industries that Scott specifically mentioned are at least somewhat repetitive, and some aspects of the work can be automated, which is something we've seen over time, leading up to the pandemic. But we also saw that amplified during the pandemic as we saw pressures for face-to-face work during the pandemic as well. But thinking about the situation that we've got right now, we're still in a situation where yes, we've got wages increasing, not quite keeping up with inflation, but we still have an extremely strong labor market, really tight in terms of low unemployment rate sustained at most recent count. We're at 4.0% in Washington state, and that's after spending some time at a record low 3.7. But as long as the demand for workers exceeds the supply of available workers, we're going to continue to see that unemployment rate low there are a number of other constraints on the labor force. There are a number of different indicators that are telling us that are telling a self-reinforcing story about a really strong labor market. I guess thinking about the unemployment rate, because that is the moment that we're in right now, I want to take a step back and think about what it actually tells us. And it doesn't tell us about necessarily job growth. It's really just telling us about how well workers who are actively seeking employment are connecting with jobs. So it's really about the connectivity. And with a low unemployment rate right now, we're seeing that workers who are in the labor force, and I think that's key, and we can move into some other discussions from there, have more leverage than they usually have in times when the unemployment rate is higher. What this means is that employers are competing with each other for a scarce labor market, and one that's very dynamic. Workers are able to connect with work very easy. What this means, how this translates into wages is, we have been seeing increasing wages, again, not keeping up with inflation, but this is one way that employers compete with each other for workers. So, we're seeing this self-reinforcing story in a number of different ways. Do I see us, this turning around on us really, really soon? I'm watching the labor force numbers right now. At this point, we still have a very tight labor market. I don't see anything turning around right away, but I do see some slowing in terms of job growth.
Okay. Gosh, you've set the stage for so many questions, whether that continued upward pressure on wages points to more inflation and Fed raising rates longer. But I'm going to sidestep that one. You've said a couple of things about labor force participation, and that partly the low unemployment is due to more people out of the labor force, not even looking for work. What do we know about those missing workers, and how do employers find them?
That has been a big challenge. It's been a shifting story. So I would have told you a little bit of a different story early on in the pandemic than I will tell right now. But it's really an important piece in understanding this moment in time. So we've been seeing demand for workers coming back very quickly. We've been seeing a lot of job growth. And in fact, this year we reached the level of employment, the number of jobs that we had in Washington State prior to the pandemic. So if you can call that recovery, then we've recovered the number of jobs. We've also seen kind of a lagging recovery of the size of the labor force, but the labor force is more correlated to population growth than it is to the number of jobs. And so what this really points to is, yes, we've recovered in terms of having the same number of workers that we had back in, before the pandemic started, but the population has grown. So we're seeing this gap is emerging as far as just not having as many workers. Just looking at some of the BLS numbers, we're looking, if we kept the same composition of the labor market that we had in 2019, we're missing about 1 million workers today. So, labor force participation rate has gone down for many groups. There are two that I think stand out as far as kind of bucking that trend and having increasing labor market participation. One is teenagers. 16 to 19-year-olds actually were able to jump into the labor market to a greater extent than we had seen before the pandemic. Part of this was, back in 2020, 2021, we had opportunities where a lot of workers were, a lot of moms, a lot of people out of the labor force for a number of reasons, and young people didn't necessarily have the same constraints, so they were able to take advantage of that and join the labor force. So that's been encouraging. Another question is looking at, the question that's out there is, are we seeing more early retirements? And that's one area where we actually see increasing labor force participation rates among the cohort of 60 to 64-year-olds. So are we seeing a lot of retirements? Yes, we've got a very large generation entering into retirement, but not early, not at an earlier rate. So, a lot of that happening. I think that.
No, go ahead.
think one other thing to point to, and I will wrap this up, but I think it's worth looking at, is really the question about barriers to employment. We know that there are long-term questions of accessibility and affordability of childcare. And when we shift over and see that, a lot of these challenges remain, they've actually exacerbated. And when we look at the payroll side, we can see that childcare and nursing homes and long-term residential care facilities are struggling to return. So a lot of people are out of the labor force because they're caring for loved ones.
Okay, and putting together some of your comments and Scott's, I mean, we've got people sitting on the sidelines, if you will. And Scott, you and I were just talking about low wages. So is there a problem with supply and demand? Should we be expecting wages to go up even more? I mean, what sort of problems do you see here really quickly?
So one, I don't see wages going up as a problem. I mean, we've maybe you've seen there's sort of a famous graph, and it's been debated a bit about productivity and wages. And textbook economic theory says if productivity goes up 2%, then wages should go up 2%. In fact, I had to prove that algebraically. And that's what happened in the US economy all through the post-war era up through the late 70s. And then at that point, they departed and productivity kept going up and wages went mostly sideways. And particularly wages were flat or declining for workers with less formal education, while they kept going up, but at a slower rate for workers with a bachelor's or higher education. And we see some of that reflected in the labor markets today in terms of the recovery of employment has been stronger for those with a bachelor's degree, much higher than average, and weaker for those with less than a bachelor's. So that is one complicating picture. We can also look at the labor market by race and see that employment went down substantially more than average for African-American women and Latinas. And the recovery has been somewhat weaker for the latest data show for white women, for African-American women, but Latinas have had positive employment growth. So there's all sorts of dynamics going on around race and education, and sort of high wage, low wage.
Okay, so along those
I
lines,
probably lost your
Well,
original
no,
question there in the thread, but
no, along those lines, we've got a question from one of the audience members asking, what reports or tools are available from Employment Security? If I'm just a layperson, but I want to understand some of what you and Annalise are talking about, and I recognize that it's complex. What should I look for? What are some of the tools and reports that you guys generate?
well, we're working on that. I'll say. So in each of the regional economists does a monthly newsletter, and in my monthly newsletter, I do quite a bit on the nation. So you have to ping me to get on the email list. It's free. Annalise does a newsletter as well, and each of us does a different flavor of it. But one of the things I've tracked pretty steadily through the recession is those national figures on demographics. And we have delayed information on demographics of the workforce at the state level. We just have it through March of 2022 at this point. And we get that from Census Bureau. There's a program the Census Bureau and the states have put together called Local Employment Dynamics. And that breaks out employment by race and education and sex.
So if I want to look for your newsletters, Annalise, can I find yours on the Employment Security website, or how would I find it?
We're not at the moment. At the moment, and I'll put my email address in the chat. But same as Scott, I produce newsletters for King, Snohomish, and Watkins, Skagit Island, and San Juan counties. And I do have a newsletter. You can just write me an email and I'll be happy to add you to my distribution list. But as far as what is available on our website from esd.wa.gov, we've got a lot. We've got a lot of data. And so it's hard to really point to just one. But in terms of convenience, in terms of something that's regularly updated and easily digested, we do have a monthly employment report that is updated every single month on our website. Basically provides a very high level view of what's happening with the unemployment rate and different industry trends at a statewide level, produced in a PDF, easy to read, easy to translate. So I guess that's where I would point people to in general to begin with. And then of course, if you want to dig deeper, you can contact any of the regional economists. Our contact information is right on our website, esd.wa.gov /labor market info.
And I think James will be giving some of this information, some of the emails and links at the end of the webinar. Annalise, back to you. Another question from the audience, because we were talking about whether we thought the tight labor market would continue for a while. This question is, given inflation coming down but still high, and the Fed raising rates, do you think the labor market could crumble, if you will, under the pressure of higher rates, and we might see unemployment go up noticeably sometime this year?
I think an attempt to dampen the labor market, and it's still firing. It's still doing really well. If you are looking for work, right now is a good time to be doing that. And workers or employers are hiring, and we continue to look at the JOLTS data. Although we are seeing some of those quits rates and total number of job openings starting to moderate, we're still in record high territory. So do I expect anything to, inflation to turn it around quickly? I think we would have already been seeing that at this point. So I kind of expect to see job growth slow, but not necessarily, turn around on us at this point.
So Hart, the other issue with the labor market that we haven't mentioned yet is long COVID. COVID in general and long COVID, which is still very much a factor. There's estimates of around 12 million people dealing with the challenge of long COVID. Many of them, it's knocked them out of the labor market. While I think there's a lot of reasons for that drop in labor force participation rate for workers below retirement age, I think if there's one possibility that stands out as the main source of that, it might be long COVID. So what we have is an economy that wants to get charging again, but we've taken out a slice of the labor market who doesn't matter what wage is being offered, they can't work. And a secondary factor is that immigration, legal and otherwise, has slowed way down. And so that's been a major source of new employees for years, and now not so much.
No, I think, we were documenting, a decade ago, the downward trend in labor force participation rate for men. And now you add long COVID and you drop immigration, and you're just really magnifying some things.
Yeah.
I'm going to, Scott, ask you and Annalise, you can jump in if you have some thoughts as well, but I'll start with Scott on healthcare. We've got a number of questions coming in from the audience about noting that the healthcare has experienced a lot of change, obviously with COVID, travel nurses, shortages, nurses going on strikes, and others. What do you see for that sector? Continued choppiness, struggles, or things smoothing out?
that's a really complex topic area.
Oh, thank you.
And a great question. And I'm not an expert on the ins and outs, but let me offer some thoughts. One is, for example, we've got in nursing homes, there was a shortage of workers before COVID, and now we're still nationally and statewide, roughly 10%. Employment is about 10% below where it was. And that's not because of lack of demand. And that has created huge issues because hospitals can't discharge ICU patients to a skilled nursing facility because there's not enough staffing there for them to take additional patients. So it's created big issues for the system. I think secondly, COVID took a pretty high stress job area and just, exponentially made it higher stress. And including in some areas, personal targeting and picketing around the whole COVID and masking and vaccine issue has really added to the stress of healthcare workers. Besides being, let's face it, as a nation, we weren't equipped to deal with the pandemic. I think everybody's acknowledged that now. So it's led, and there's some parallels with education. It's led to some really good skilled people to say, that's it, I'm done, I don't care what you pay me. I have to look for work doing something else. So are we gonna, and to take a bigger step back, because financing of healthcare, including our health insurance system, hasn't been stable. We know hospitals have gone through waves where they're tightening things down, and so cutting back on staff. And again, that places stress on staff, and they've tried to shift some functions from, say, RNs down to LPNs or CNAs. And then sometimes it comes back the other way. And so now we've got a shortage of nurses because we've laid them off before. We've had those kind of back and forth over the last couple of decades that don't make it conducive to have a kind of a stable workforce system for healthcare, as well as stable patient care. So now we've got a big debate statewide at the legislature. The nurses want to establish ratios of nurses to patients and make that binding. And of course, employers, hospitals are fighting that. But trying to ease that stress that is big in the system right now. So there's a lot of challenges there, and I don't see that going away anytime soon.
I guess I would just add in, when Scott mentioned the pressures on nursing and long-term care facilities really impacting the rest of the healthcare system. A lot of, we know that a lot of hospitals are not able to release people that are no longer acute care, but not ready to go home yet, that there aren't necessarily enough beds. So it kind of is challenging the whole system. But I'd also point out that this connects us back to the informal care economy as well. As long as those nursing and long-term care facilities are struggling, it puts pressure on hospitals and other parts of the healthcare system, but it also puts pressure on families, with people being released earlier than they would have otherwise, and a lot of care falling on family members. So that's been a challenge. I guess one other thing I'd mention is that this is not a labor market that is, you have a job opening and anybody can come in and take it. The healthcare system has very strict credentials that they need to follow. You can't just, be pretty close to being an RN and we'll train you up. You've got to have the appropriate credentials for your job. And so that's also one of the constraints that healthcare faces in terms of being able to access that they need to have their workers trained when they're coming in the door.
Well, and reading in Washington, the debate over the debt ceiling may have cuts to programs like Medicare in it. So this is only going to get more interesting in the days ahead. I've got a couple of questions I want to get to from the audience, but first I'm going to sneak one in. Different sector. And Annalise, I'll start with you. The tech sector, we're hearing about layoffs, or they're underway some, at Amazon or others in our region. What's your take on the path forward for the folks in tech who are getting laid off? Does that send a signal to you that something is sort of a canary in the coal mine signal, or is it just some sort of expected churning because those industries grew so much through the pandemic and they just need to cool off a little bit?
I'd say the latter. In the lead up to the pandemic, the information sector and other tech heavy industries was a very high growth set of industries going into the pandemic. But then during the pandemic, we used the technology, used their products and services more than we ever had. And we were on this collective learning curve of figuring out how to work from home and making investments in technologies that allowed telecommuting, and entertainment was a lot more investment in streaming and a lot more investment in video games. We consumed a lot of the products and services they produce, but case in point, I'm on Zoom right now and it's already been installed on my work computer, and they've already, they don't need to buy new streaming services, and the technology's already been invested in. So at this point, there's kind of been this plateau of users. So in a way, it's just kind of the end of a long and intense growth period. In terms of what we've been seeing, and certainly Seattle is a hub for a lot of tech employers, we do see a lot of these layoffs happening. And I do not mean to diminish any of this. Every single layoff impacts a person, impacts their families. And it's a large number of layoffs, but that large number is actually a fairly small proportion of the total number of jobs. So I don't see this necessarily fundamentally shifting anything in tech industries, but I do see, this is going, it will be felt. This is a large number of jobs, but we're also in a situation where a lot of other industries and smaller employers are looking for similar talent sets. So, it's not, I guess right now we're kind of waiting to see how many of those jobs are going to be absorbed. Another thing that I want to point out, just in my data world, this is going to be a really hard one to track. We know that some of these layoffs are happening. We know that some of them have been announced. And sometimes it takes a while for our data to catch up with that information for a number of reasons, including that a lot of these jobs have severance pay attached to them, which means that they might not show up for a couple months, even though some of these layoffs might be happening right now. So this is going to be a tricky one to follow and really quantify as in real time. But I think that right now we've got a lot of job openings in different sectors. So there's probably large portion will be able to be absorbed.
Okay.
And for that, the same reasons that Annalise brought up, those folks won't be showing up in our claims data as well. If you're getting severance, then you're technically still employed, and so you won't be filing an employment claim.
So you might, if the severance pay does exactly what it's supposed to do and coasts you over to your next job, then you won't show up in the UI system at all. If not, it'll be a couple months delayed.
And you guys don't have perfect information right at your fingertips that's always current. That's a shock. I mean, we're getting pushed in two directions with some of the audience questions. One definitely towards questions around hybrid work. But Scott, let me ask one, because before I lose this one question from the audience.
Yeah.
Is automation a key here? We're talking about tight labor market in a variety of sectors. Do you see automation as the answer to the shortages? Nobody working in the McDonald's or burger just comes out on a conveyor belt.
Not in a nursing home. And that's it's the service versus product kind of issue here. I mean, there's automation has been pretty steady for, you know, a couple of 100 years. Well, it's had its peaks and valleys, but that's ongoing. And we see it a little bit in restaurants with the, you know, you order from, if you go in and sit down, you can order from your table instead of having somebody come take your order. So there's a bit of that going on, but there's also limits to what that can do. So it's not the answer, but it's always been and will continue to be an answer.
Part of your puzzle, as is changing programs in professional and technical education to try to fill some of these gaps as quickly as possible, and so on. Annalise, coming back to you, you had mentioned the childcare, and this is going to be a bit tricky. I think we're going to come at this topic with a couple of different questions, so you don't have to try to say everything right now. But if people now have jobs that allow or require 3 days in the office and 2 days home, you know, I'm wondering, how does that remote work or that hybrid work affect labor force participation? Is that something that you can think out loud on?
Well, I think right now, you know, with the low unemployment rate, we've got workers have more leverage than they do during time periods when the unemployment rate is higher. And so, you know, workers are able to kind of make demands that they might not normally be able to make. So does that, you know, it sweetens the pot a little bit. So I think that has an impact on labor force participation. But, you know, as far as that childcare question explicitly, we've got, you know, the supply is down. You know, we talked in when we were looking at the nursing home question, we mentioned that this is a workforce that was already a challenge. A lot of low wage work, a lot of difficult working conditions, and I would extend that as well to childcare. We are struggling to, you know, the childcare industry is another one that has struggled to come back. And I think that in some ways, let's take a giant step back. This isn't unique to this moment in time. This has been a challenge for decades. We've been talking about the challenges of availability and affordability of childcare. It's just, it got amplified during this time period. Is hybrid or online, you know, work from home a solution? It's a partial solution. But I think it also comes down to the question of who are we trying to attract, which industries, which workers. Generally speaking, what must, the more educated you are, the more likely you are, the more likely you are to have a desk job, the more likely you are to be able to, navigate that. The more likely you are also to be able to afford childcare and, have access to childcare. So it's really kind of falling to a larger extent on families that do have that service-oriented work that might not be able to have that flexibility to work from home. So it's really going to vary depending on what segment of the market you're in.
Yeah, and just a little bit of good news from the numbers is that nationally childcare employment is still down about, I think, around 8 or 9% from pre-pandemic. So it's even worse than the pre-pandemic shortage. Statewide, that gap by June, and this is just the latest data out, was down to 2%. So still worse than it was pre-pandemic, but not as bad as it is nationally in terms of employment at childcare centers.
Got it. I'm going to change gears a little bit. I've got a couple of questions on one of them is on the job training. So Scott, do you see industry working on training development on the job to create a pipeline for workers? Is that going to be crucial? Or I guess I'm wondering about job requirements
So, we're starting to hear some of that anecdotally. I have no idea how to measure that in any objective way. And I mean, what I find over the years is that we hear anecdotes and people kind of draw a straight line and say, this is the trend, everybody's doing it, when it's actually pretty marginal. So I would expect that there will be some response, but I think unless this goes on for years, I think seeing structural responses, I think we'll have to go on for years before we see a real structural change. I think the current patterns of behavior are pretty ingrained in terms of employers continue to look for the perfect candidate.
Well, I'll ask a strange question along that. I mean, are people expecting this to end fairly soon? I mean, one of the things that I was reading about lately and thinking about labor force was, the birth rate in a lot of places, US included, fell sharply in the wake of the Great Recession in 2008.
Right.
And so you have several years there, 2008, 9, 10, where you had fewer babies, just a smaller population. As that rolls forward, you're now hearing people talk about the enrollment cliff that's expected soon, because enrollment, down in high school, it's going to be down in colleges. Is anyone talking about the effect of that small group on the labor force?
I mean, this is kind of in 2005, I was doing presentations about the coming retirement cliff. Look out, there's going to be a huge shortage because all these workers are turning 55 and then 65, and then the 2008 recession hit, and that topic just disappeared from people's minds because we had such a oversupply, under demand of labor for 10 years coming out of the Great Recession. So it should be. Is it? I don't think so. And that's a huge change in how we think about infrastructure, both in K-12 and post-secondary education. It's going to be real interesting to see how that plays out. But yes, the fertility rate is in the US is 1.6. You need to be a little over 2 to just keep the population constant long term. Without immigration, we would be in a declining population state already. Not state, population for the nation would be declining. So that's a big issue coming up. And then it's going to be compounded, I think, in the Pacific Northwest by climate migration. We already know that a lot of the migrants coming up from Central America are coming in part because of the gang violence, but in large part because they were having crop failures from climate change. And that's, we know what's happening in the Southwest of this country. Are we going to see a large migration within the US from, say, the Southwest to the Northwest and other areas in the North that are less impacted by drought? That's a big question.
No, okay. No. I mean,
What's the answer?
You're hinting at the fact that we're in something of a big experiment. And Annalise, I'm going to turn to you, and you may also say something about a big experiment. I read that some employers, some managers are saying, all right, staff, back in the office, you're not very productive working from home. But then I'll read an article, another company will say, oh, productivity is great, people are more engaged, work from home. How do I make sense of some of that inconsistency?
I think that your comment about it being an experiment that we're in right now is spot on. I think that, we're getting a lot of mixed signals. We had a lot of our large companies a year ago saying, okay, back to the office, and then walking that back when their employees disagreed. Again, this is going to come back to right now, employees have a lot of leverage in terms of, that low unemployment rate, the high quits rate. They've got more leverage at this particular moment in time. And so that's kind of putting the brakes on, or at least modifying some of the return to work plans, especially for workers, with desk jobs and high tech. But I think, looking ahead at what this might look like, first, I'll point to this isn't new. The scale of it is absolutely new. But, for years we've heard, one company, having Fridays off and then a new manager coming in and, claiming Fridays back, back in the office. There's been a lot of shifts, and a lot of the time all it takes is a new CEO to kind of shift what the culture is and what the expectations are. Looking ahead to, when are we going to see return to the office, or where are we going to see return to the office? I think we're still in this stage where we're figuring it out bit by bit. But I think we're going to see different patterns depending on which anchor tenant, which large employer in different cities kind of gets to shape the conversation. So thinking about this tech sector, we've got a lot of large employers thinking about, do we go back to work yet? Do we not go back to work yet? I'm interested to see which one goes first. If we see Alphabet or Google or Yahoo say back to the office first, then we're going to see the Bay Area, going back to the office before other areas, and we'll start to see that play out. If Amazon is the first to say back to the office, then Seattle will show up before San Francisco, for example. So, I'm interested to see, because I think that the large employers are going to kind of get to shape that conversation and shape that ecosystem and the trends for their local areas, but not until the unemployment rate starts to climb up a little bit, because right now the employees have a lot more influence than usual.
So, in addition to that anchor employer idea, different cities will find a different balance in the future, right? Because of the industry mix that they have. Scott, you and I have talked about, I'm thinking about these hybrid workers and this balance. You and I have talked about different settings about commuting patterns and how good is the data. What does remote work do to your ability to talk about economic activity in a particular city or county? Because now the job and where the employer lives and where the job is can be quite different. Is it just nightmarish, or is there some?
It raises a lot of questions because employers report to us. They're only required to report one work site, their state headquarters site, and many employers, they have one work site. Many of the multi-site employers do break that out. In fact, almost all the large ones do. And we know that there's a fair number, mostly I think mid-size employers who are multi-site who do not break it out. And when I've done some, estimates of what that is, what that means is Seattle ends up, the reported employment in Seattle is tens of thousands of jobs higher than it actually is, because that branch office in Spokane or Yakima or Vancouver isn't reported in our data. So, and then you add on to that the increasing number of, so in the 2021 American Community Survey, both Clark County and statewide, it was about 20% of respondents reported working at home. And I don't think there was a question that broke that out between hybrid and 100% work at home.
Right.
But there's clearly been a big increase in that. How that shows up in our place of work data, yeah, it's going to make something where we already knew there was a bit of error in that because of the reporting issue, becomes even more nuanced.
Okay. Well,
Goes back to James's point.
Along those lines, and we've got to be very mindful of time.
Yeah.
What one or two warnings would you give people about the data? If you were going to try to help me be a better consumer of the data that you guys are producing, you've both mentioned time lags and the information that you get, and now we're talking about sort of reporting quirks. Really, really quickly, what's something that you would want people to know about the labor market data to help them think about it better in the future?
One is all data is preliminary, and it gets revised, and sometimes a month later, well, always a month later, but also 6 months later. There's usually a benchmarking, we call it, and then other national data gets revised. I mean, GDP goes through a big revision every 5 years. Okay. So take all the data with a grain of salt, because it does get revised. Go ahead, Annalise, were you gonna?
Along those lines, I'm going to just say there's always a trade-off between the most recent data that we're making decisions right now based on, and the good data, which is going to be older. So there's always kind of that trade-off. I'd also, one thing that I've been doing, especially during this pandemic, is scaling up. Whenever it makes sense to scale up, do, because you've got a larger sample and you're going to get a more complete story. So that unfortunately makes it really difficult to drill down on small counties and understand what's happening right now. But for the most part, the approach I've been taking is, if the question can be answered adequately at a statewide level, that's where I want to start, because the samples are going to bounce around a lot less.
So when you say scale up, it's don't necessarily focus on your city. Maybe think about your county. Be aware that the data might not answer it well for the county, so think about state and on. Yeah. I'm going to try to sneak it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Scott.
The unemployment rate has a big plus or minus around it. Nationally, it's plus or minus 1/10 of a point. It's a really good number. Statewide, you're more at plus or minus 1/2 a point, which means that the unemployment rate has to change by at least 1/2 a point before we can say, yeah, things got better or got worse. And county level, you're looking at least a point.
So I shouldn't ask you about unemployment in my neighborhood.
Yeah. Just it's horseshoes and hand grenades kind of.
I'm going to try to sneak in one quick question before James gives us the hook. How can people in career and technical education, whether it's the technical colleges, I'll add in community colleges, how can they engage better with labor or the employers? Either. How can they figure out how to train workers to fill some of these gaps? Any thoughts there?
Well, I think that there's a lot of people are having this conversation. How do you get workers into jobs? But I think that a lot of the conversations happen in silos. And so the question really comes down to, how do you figure out how to get both sides talking to each other meaningfully? And I think some of that, there are a lot of tools available beyond just, coming to the table, but, for the colleges and technical centers, be thinking about ways to get students into workplaces, whether it's formally through, pre-apprenticeship types of programs, or pizza with an employer kinds of programs. I think that the conversation needs to be happening, and I think a lot of conversations are happening, but I think they're happening in silos.
Yeah, I think the CTE programs, considering their funding, do a pretty phenomenal job. It's really tough to get employer engagement, and it just is, and that's kind of part of the culture of employers in the U.S. Is that we don't see the really cooperative programs here, or very few of them, compared to what takes place in Europe, where there's more of a culture of, yeah, we're all in this together.
I guess one thing I would like to add is, a lot of the time we've got, maybe employers are busy, we all know they're busy, but figuring out how to bring a consortium together, bring a lot of the different community colleges and organizations that are trying to get this conversation going into one conversation with employers, not spreading it out across the different organizations. I think that, partnering could probably bring about good, robust conversations.
And that's partly a funding issue for funding staffing for that. And the other issue is, somebody who was on a school board, is that there's a whole lot of parents out there who think my kids going to Princeton, and that's success, and anything short of that is not. And I'm exaggerating here, but being the parent of somebody with a 4-year history degree who's happy as a clam being a carpenter, 9 years in, and doing quite well. I'm ecstatic that he's happy and has a great career. So I'm also happy you went to university. That's fine. That's valuable. But there's a whole lot of ways to get to good jobs that don't require a 4-year degree.
So there are good ways to get to good jobs, and maybe new ways to find people that are qualified, rather than the old ads that have been used for years and years. James, I'm not done, but it looks like you're here to give me the hook.
I'm here with the hook. I'm sorry.
All right.
All these people that joined us today live, they have lives to live, and I'm sure employers to keep happy as well. But I want to thank each of you. Annalise, Scott, you as always, just fonts of amazing information. And we will be sending out the links here with your contact information, so be prepared. Hart, thank you for keeping these two on track and focused on a discussion, because we could wander for hours here. And I thank you all of you in our audience for joining us today for Western Insights. This and previous Western Insights sessions are all available online for your late night viewing needs. We will be sending you an email shortly with a link to those sessions, further resources from our panel, and also an invitation to give some feedback on this session if you're interested. From all of us at Western Washington University and the College of Business and Economics, we want to thank you for being here today. We also want to thank the Western Alumni Association and the Western Foundation for their support of this series. And I know they'd like us to thank those of you who chose to financially support the university as part of this effort as well. On behalf of all of us, have a fantastic Friday. It's Friday the 13th if you're doing this live, and have a great winter.